Hello, thank you for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. I'm David Pendergrass. I want to follow up a little bit on a podcast I did on atheism and morality. In that podcast, which I hope you'll go listen to, it's A Glimpse of the Kingdom. Go to iTunes or your other favorite app where you listen to podcasts, A Glimpse of the Kingdom, and there's a blog called Atheism and Morality. I want to follow up a little bit about that. On atheism and morality, I said a lot of things, so I won't repeat all that here. But in a nutshell, I try to suggest and argue that objective moral values do exist. They really do exist. And that we have a good reason to think that certain things really are objectively wrong and certain things are objectively right. They're good. And I try to deal with certain objections to that, like, well, we've been taught that, and then things change and develop over time and so forth. I give a long analogy about mathematics. So I hope you'll listen to that. My first podcast was really to try to demonstrate that objective moral values and duties do exist. I asked the question in a rhetorical form in that podcast, why do we think objective moral values exist? Now, there are atheists who do not think they do exist, and that's what I try to deal with. But there are atheists who, in fact, who do believe in objective moral values. Dr. Shelley Kagan at Yale University, who's an atheist, he might call himself agnostic. I'm not sure what he calls himself, but he's certainly not a theist. He believes, he's a great example of an atheist who does believe in objective moral values. But if I were to ask him, why is it that there are objective moral values and duties? He would say, you can go to read his literature, you can even look on YouTube. He has discussions and lectures, and he has debates. William Lane Craig, he does a lot of different media things that you can read or listen to. But what he would say is that it's because we're reasonable. It's only reasonable to assume that certain things objectively exist, and that we don't have to prove it. They're axiomatic, and we don't have to prove that some things are objective. I completely concur with him. I think it is axiomatic. That is to say, it is self-obviously true. And I say that in other podcasts, that I can know that it is right to be kind, it's right to preserve human life and so forth, and it's wrong to torture and wrong to rape, a whole host of things. I know it's wrong. I know certain things are right just because it's self-evidently true. Like it is self-evidently true that I exist, and that the past occurred and the future is going to happen. At least I trust it. But it's self-evidently true. I don't need to scientifically demonstrate that. So we're on the same page with that. But where we would disagree is on why it is we have these things, like I said. And he thinks it's just because we're reasonable to do so. He would say, for example, you look at the laws of logic. If you have the law of non-contradiction and you contradict yourself, then you have violated that, as it were, law. Now, he would say, is it like a law such that we have to do it? So this is where he starts equivocating. And equivocation in logic, or any language, is when you change the vocabulary definition, when you change it. When we say the phrase, the law of logic, we really mean something like the principle of logic. When we follow the canons of logic, these are guiding principles. It is not a law in that it's something I ought to do or ought not to do. If I say the law of gravity, it is rather the principle of gravity. What I mean by that is, it is what I expect to happen over and over. Now, C.S. Lewis answers all of Shelley Kagan's objections, seems to me, and almost every other atheist. You need to read Mere Christianity, and he has a couple, 2 or 3 chapters on morality, and they're outstanding. In fact, you can go to YouTube, and this is really, really cool if you don't know this. You can go to YouTube and look up C.S. Lewis Doodle, and that's a funny name. C.S. Lewis Doodle, a guy draws out his pictorial representations of someone who is reading Mere Christianity, and they do a really good job. Anyway, if you looked, if I have a rock and I drop it out of my hand, the rock falls on the ground. All I'm doing is telling you what it will do next time based on the presumption that it happened over and over and over again. We'll call that thing a law. Laws of science, and scientists get this wrong, it seems to me, and certainly when it comes to debates and presentations, all the time. All the time. Stephen Hawking in his books that I've read from him get this wrong. And he knows better. So I don't know if it's just rhetorical flair or whatever, but I'm assuming he surely knows better. Laws don't create, they don't cause, and they are not defined as the patterns that must take place. A law is a recurring pattern that we expect to take place the next time we observe it. I expect a rock to fall from my hand because I expect gravity to be there, but I'm assuming it. And sometimes we call that the law of uniformity or the principle of uniformity. I assume it'll be uniform. I assume that light travels the same speed here as it does on the other side of the universe and so forth. Well, I have to assume that. There is no governing principle. There's no scientific reason to assume it must be that way. A law is not, again, one more time, a scientific law is not something that is impenetrable. It is an assumption of a pattern. That's all it is. So the law of gravity is what I expect to happen because I've observed it over and over and over and over again. We assume it's going to happen one more time. We assume it. So let me reflect for a little bit, because these two different ways of using the word law is different in morality when we use something called the moral law. What the laws of logic demonstrate is that you cannot break certain quote-unquote laws of logic, for example, the law of non-contradiction, without being irrational. That is true. So you would be deemed as irrational if you commit a paralogism. That is, you're illogical. But the laws of logic don't tell me I should be logical. They just demonstrate what happens if I am being irrational. They don't tell me how I should be. There's no obligation on my part as David to be logical. There's no obligation. It just tells me what the rules are. If I am self-contradictory, if I say I cannot speak English, that is self-contradictory because I just use English to say that. I do not speak English. Now, the laws of logic don't tell me I should think rationally and logically. They just tell me what happens if I break the rules. When it comes to the laws of science, they only tell me what the patterns are. They don't tell me what it should do. A rock that falls is not obeying the law of gravity. Rather, humans use the word law of gravity to describe the pattern that we have observed. There's no reason to think at all that the rock is conscious or in any way aware, following a law and say, you know what, I should fall to the ground, or I should fall to mass, the heaviest mass nearby me, and whatever. So what they have in common is the word law is not used in the same way as what we mean when it comes to moral law, and sometimes even political law. But in a moral law, what we mean is how I ought to behave. We can use a similar, I'm going to talk more about that in a second, but a third example. People often use mathematics and say, well, mathematics are that way. If we're just rational, 2 + 2 = 4. I ought not say 5 because that's wrong. No, the laws of mathematics do not dictate that I shouldn't break it. It just demonstrates what happens if I do break the laws of mathematics. It becomes nonsense. You're just wrong, like the laws of logic. Morality is different. Morality is different. And this is where Shelley Kagan at Yale is wrong. This is where he's mistaken. The reason why morality doesn't fit the rational inference or answer he said, that is, remember, he said, why is it that objective moral values and duties exist? Well, because we're rational. Rational people can agree together on what is objectively moral and valuable and so forth. The reason why that's false is because logic and reason do not dictate morality. Science doesn't dictate morality. Mathematics doesn't dictate morality. Morality is a different kind of thing. Morality, the moral law, tells us what we ought to do. What we ought to do. Not what we do, but what we ought to do. What you should do in a situation. And the one reason we know the ought feeling is there is what happens when we don't do what we know we ought to do. We have an accompanying feeling, and it's called guilt. Nobody feels guilty because they got the wrong answer on a math problem. You don't need priests in Algebra 2 class. You don't need a psychologist to deal with self-forgiveness, because nobody feels guilty when they get the wrong answer. Nobody feels guilty because they were illogical. They might feel shame because so many thinker types just worship being rational, and they're embarrassed, but they don't feel guilty. They don't feel guilty. The reason why we feel guilt is because we feel like there was an oughtness about what we should have done. And when we didn't do it, and we know we should have done it, we ought to have done it, we feel an accompanying feeling. That reminds me of something. I knew a guy I worked with who grew up in an atheist home, had no religion, never went to church, never talked about Jesus or God at all. Rarely. If it was in passing because they were atheists. He had sex with his girlfriend. He was in high school. And I asked him all these questions. When did you first start thinking there was a God? He said, I had sex with my girlfriend. I looked at him kind of crazy. He said, well, growing up in an atheist household, and he told me all that. Then he said, I was struck by the fact that I felt guilty when I had sex with her. He said, I didn't feel guilty. I was angry. I resented the fact that I felt guilty. I remember thinking, this is dumb. No one's telling me not to do this. She's cool with it. I'm cool with it. I don't believe in a religion. I don't have parents breathing down my neck. I don't have a youth group saying true love waits. And he felt very mad about it. But he could not shake feeling terribly guilty. And then he thought, if I feel guilty about this, where do I get this sense of guilt? Why is it I feel wrong for doing this? And that started his journey to start believing in a moral law. If there's a moral law, he got to thinking, well, where does this come from? Why do I have this sense of guilt, but also this sense that I ought not do it, that I should not do it? Now, I know all people don't feel guilty the same way. All I'm saying is he's an example of that sense of guilt when there's no religious influence at all. Now, let that sink in for a second. There's different for logic, math, and science. Humans behave or don't behave according to a law that tells them what they should or ought to do. So when someone tries to answer the question, well, where does it come from? Why is it that humans around the globe pick up on the sense of moral values and duties and guilt when they violate it? Where does that come from? It seems to me, and there's a lot of different answers, but it seems to me there are only two major answers given. One is the atheistic worldview, which says it comes from societies. It comes from the herd. The problem is, as C.S. Lewis says very well, the herd instinct doesn't help you because moral values and duties dictate which instincts to choose. You can't say instinct, herd instinct of the masses, because we all just come up with the same views. That's not compelling. Because the moral law tells us which instinct to choose. Lewis says it's like sheet music to a piano. There are keys on the piano, white and black keys, but the music tells us which one to push. He said the moral law is like that. The keys are like our instincts. The music, the sheet music, is like the moral law. It tells us which instinct to choose or suppress. And societies don't decide that for us. Societies do not, nor can they, for then it's no longer objective. And that's something that's so surprising to me when Shelley Kagan at Yale says that societies decide. Society is the source of why we should behave a certain way, because society tells us. Social contract theory and all that. Well, that's just uncompelling and unconvincing on every possible reason. Because on that view, you have no reason at all to think any other society that's done something immoral is in fact doing something immoral. You have no grounds to say that the Nazis were immoral because that's just what their culture told them to believe and to do and to practice. You have no grounds to do that. But let that sink in. If society tells me what is good and what is bad, then that's all it means, which means my society gets to tell me. So who are you to tell me that? That's what a Nazi would say today. A Nazi would say, who are you to tell me what's right and what's wrong? This is exactly what my culture has decided is true. Now, granted, many people in Germany disagree with them. The Nazis would say, well, you're just wrong. I've evolved in such a state that I don't need your opinion is irrelevant. This is what society, our society now dictates. All of the rest of Europe and the Allied power and forces were all breaking etiquette to tell us we're wrong. Because my herd instinct under Hitler and all my fellow soldiers agree that this is exactly what my culture should do. And if you find that morally reprehensible, what I'm saying, that would be just stupid and wrong to think that Nazis are not absolutely inherently wrong but what they did, then you agree with me. It can't be based on social convention. It cannot be. It means we have no right, no grounding, no moral grounding to tell cultures they've done something wrong. And remember, that's exactly what we do as humans. We do not say that animals are acting immoral. We just don't. When my dog attacks my cat, he's not being immoral. When, I think it was Craig who says, when a lion forcibly copulates with a female lion, he doesn't rape the lioness. He forcibly copulates. But if I saw a man walking down the street on the sidewalk here in Texas, and he jumped on top of her and had his way with her and had sex with her, I don't say, hey, his society must think that's good, so therefore I have no right to judge him. He's just doing his thing. He's just following his instincts. No, I think he's done something wrong and immoral. Let me say this last thing. Not only in morality do we have a feeling of guilt when we've broken the moral law, and we don't have that with any other thing we call law, but we have certain views about other people. Other people. We assume other people have done something wrong. And that's a big deal. That is to say, I assume you also can pick up on the moral law too. I love how Lewis says this. If a man trips me and I fall down and hurt myself, but I know that the man did it on accident, I'm not mad at him. I don't feel resentment. I don't need to forgive him in that sense because it's an accident. If a man tries to trip me but does not, I am mad at the man. And I think the man has done something immoral. So where he didn't mean to trip me and it caused me physical pain, that's a worse physical situation than it is the man who did not trip me, but he tried to. I'm mad at the second man, not the first. Let that sink in. I assume the second man who did try to trip me, but it didn't happen, I think that man has done something immoral. He ought not have done that. He should not have tried. I assume that about everybody in life. Everybody in life. When I go to the grocery store or go to the gym, wherever I go, I assume everyone around me also has access to this moral law. And I can look at their behavior and assume that they are wrestling or giving into the moral law. And isn't it interesting? Lewis makes this other point. We cannot break the laws of nature. That is to say, I can try to fly by creating airplanes and wings and helicopters and so forth, but I'm not breaking the laws of gravity. I'm not breaking them at all. In fact, I have to make up an instrument to help me break the force of it itself, but I'm not breaking the law of gravity. The law of gravity is pushing hard on me just as hard as it always is. So I have to make a rocket to get beyond it and so forth, but I'm not breaking the law. But when it comes to morality, it's weird because, like science, everyone has access to it. We're all bound by the laws of gravity. But the laws of morality, we can break. It seems to be the only laws that we know everybody is under, but not everyone does. We have the freedom to break the moral law. Again, by analogy, if I could break the law of gravity right now and say I choose to stop obeying the law of gravity, I'd start floating. It'd feel like floating and look like floating if I chose to break it. But I can't do that. I can choose to break the moral law. And when I choose to break the moral law, guess what I feel? Yep, I feel guilty. I feel guilty. And I look down upon, and all humans do, all rational, moral people, look down on other people in a shameful way if they don't feel guilty for the moral law they've broken. That's exactly why we get so crazy upset at politicians and media people and Hollywood, whatever, when they do something wrong, have an affair, steal the money, whatever, and they never apologize. We want them so desperately to say, don't you realize you've done something wrong? You need to acknowledge it. You acknowledge you've done something wrong. But no one says, no, evolution made me do it. I'm just dancing to the tune of my DNA. My culture told me that's okay. My parents taught me. No one gives a rip. They've done something wrong, and they knew better. They knew better. Now, to be clear, they don't need my social condemnation to feel guilty. They do not. I've met so many people in counseling situations and in friendships where people have told me I felt guilty for years and no one knew about it. That's how guilt works. That's why one of the main definitions of addiction is when you hold it a secret. That is to say, no one in society is telling you shouldn't do it. And yet inside you are bombarded. You are overwhelmed with guilt. No other human told you not to do it, but you feel guilty. No one's found you exposed, yet you feel guilty. And the question is, where does that come from? Let me say this real quickly and wrap up. In the Christian worldview, there are different explanations for where it comes from. Some say morality, if it is objective moral values and duties, kind of float out there like mathematical truths, like 2 + 2 = 4, or the laws of logic. These are just true facts of the universe, and we don't need a God or so forth to make it for us. Most Christians hold to kind of the standard view is this, and the one I find by far the most compelling. The reason why we have laws of logic and the laws of mathematics is because our minds have been endowed with capacity to, as it were, tap into the divine mind. God thinks rationally. God developed and created mathematics and so forth, so he gave us access to that. We have access to it. Much like our brain, if you imagine our minds could pick up a certain frequency of a radio signal, we can pick up on that. That's certainly my view. When it comes to morality tells me what I should do, I ought to do. And there's a word we have that in any language when it comes to grammar. That is, it's in the imperative sense. It's a commandment. It's a commandment. Now, that's why it seems to me the most compelling answer is, why do we feel commandments? Because there's a commander. I just don't see I've never heard, and I've never read any other possibly convincing explanation for why it is we feel commandments. Now, let me be very clear here. When I say the word commandment, I don't mean a commandment necessarily in the Bible, though that can happen. What I'm saying is the moral values and duties that people feel are because they have access, like the radio frequency, to a moral law giver. The moral law giver gives commandments. He gives commandments. He gives the moral law, which tells us what we should and should not do. If we don't have a moral law giver, I don't know why moral laws exist. I don't know why I feel a sense of oughtness and a sense of guilt when I break it. So my view is called the divine command theory view, and that's a very common view, and there are objections to it, and I've read a lot of them. I don't find them even compelling. The divine command theory view is that an action is moral because it comes from a commandment that comes from the very character of God himself. That's what makes it moral. It comes from a commandment that comes from the very character of God himself. So, no, you don't have to know God or know God exists before an action is moral. You do not have to be a Christian to know that something is moral. No, but rather, the reason why you know it is moral and the reason why you know it's good is because ultimately it comes from a good God. So to say it one more time, it is not to suggest that only theists and only Christians and whatnot, they're the only ones who can do a moral thing. No, I'm talking about moral ontology, the grounding of morality. Why is it good to preserve human life? Because we get that from a moral commandment deep inside of us, as it were, and that comes from the character of God, who commands humans to preserve human life outside of very particular situations. Why is it wrong to rape? Because that commandment, don't do it, comes from a moral God who knows we shouldn't rape. Why are humans more valuable than other creatures? Why should we protect them at more cost? If I had to choose between my dog and another human being, a stranger, someone I don't even know, I had to save my dog or a stranger, a human life, I would save the human life. That preservation of human life comes from a moral commandment, and it's good because it comes from a good God who wants humans to do their very best to preserve human life. So that's what divine command theory basically is, and that's what I find the most compelling. So commandments in that sense, come from that in a, almost you might say cosmic sense of divine command theory. Now, there are also particular commandments that God reveals in the Bible, and then we also know those things are moral. For example, some things we would never have known that are moral, like divorce. I would never have guessed that God hated divorce or didn't like it at all until I read the Old Testament and certainly the teachings of Jesus. I would not have known homosexual behavior would be immoral had I not known it had been revealed to me. I mean, I'm going to look at nature and say, well, it doesn't seem natural, because it's not natural, because we all know about body parts. What I mean is I would not know it's unethical, immoral, unless Jesus had said that Matthew 19, how a man and woman should be married, and outside of that, you're celibate, and that's it. So the things like that are revealed in the Christian scriptures, that you do need to read the scriptures or be taught by a Christian to realize that objective moral values and duties are extended. There are more than you might think of, because we have been revealed certain things by Jesus. Well, enough of that for now. God bless you. Hope you keep thinking about morality. Until next time. Thank you so much for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. If you want to listen to more, go to my website, davidpendergrass.com, and look at one of the tabs that says podcast. If you click that, it'll take you straight to my podcast on iTunes, or you can search for it on iTunes if you want to, A Glimpse of the Kingdom. But also on my website, you'll see another way to get, if you're an Android listener on your phone, or you just don't use Mac computers. Again, davidpendergrass.com, and click podcast. It'll take you exactly where you need to go, and you can subscribe from there and get this as often as you like, and also see my blogs and so forth. If you want to get me to come to your organization or church, otherwise to do some consulting, you need to go to davidpendergrassconsulting.com. davidpendergrassconsulting.com. You'll see the information there. If you want to reach out to me on Twitter, you can find me at Dr. D. Pendergrass, at Dr. D. Pendergrass.